Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event, and thank you for so many of you for joining us today. My name is Yuko Thomas. I'm the co-chair of events for the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom. This is a truly global effort for the Harvard clubs across the world. HCUK is hosting today on our tech platform. I'm joined today by Vicky Lung, my co-chair of events on the board, as well as Stefan Serban, who is on one of our shared interest groups. So just a few brief reminders. This is recorded today. If you are on our Zoom platform, you'll be able to submit questions through that at the end. This is also being broadcast on YouTube, but you will not be able to submit questions through that. And anyone who wants the recording afterwards will be sent that afterwards. So this is our second allyship event for Ukraine. I just wanted to briefly discuss what the allyship series is. So this has been going for a few years now. It's an intra-club and intra-SIG, shared interest group effort to raise awareness for and to combat any form of discrimination and bias. The allyship events are not a fundraising platform. Our constituents are members of the HAA community, but the allyship team does not represent an official conduit for Harvard and HAA messages. We do encourage our panelists to speak about their firsthand charitable endeavors and give them the opportunity to provide information on charities that they personally support, however. And we encourage audience members to learn about ways to help by contacting our panelists after our events. And so during this presentation, we'll post at our panelists' request their contact information and resources that can guide attendees on how to help Ukraine. So now I'm going to hand over to Alice Hill, who is a former president of the Harvard Alumni Association, to give an Indigenous acknowledgement on behalf of the Allyship series. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuko. Womanjika, which in the language of the Kulin Nations of Southeastern Australia means both welcome and come with purpose. And we're certainly here with purpose. Both the Allyship series and the Harvard Alumni Association board start their meetings with an Indigenous acknowledgement. I'm especially thrilled to give this acknowledgement from Australia, as it's modeled on the modern and ancient Australian traditions of acknowledgement of country. From its origins, our Harvard alumni community has been anchored and enriched by First Nations people from across the Americas and around the world. The land in which Harvard is situated has been a place of learning for millennia, where First Nations people have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the place on which Harvard stands, the people of the Massachusetts tribe and their elders, past, present, and emerging, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Nipmuc and Wampanoag peoples, with whom Harvard has a long historical relationship. And I acknowledge and pay my respects to all other First Nation elders who've joined us today. Back to you, Yuko.
Thanks very much, Alice. So now on to the discussion. I won't introduce everyone, just to give you a brief overview. We have several panelists today directly from the Harvard Club of Ukraine, some of whom are actually on the ground, and they will introduce themselves. We also have some distinguished speakers. Vasyl Myroshnychenko, the ambassador to Ukraine in Australia, has joined us today. And we will have as our keynote speaker today, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia. He is currently the president and CEO of the Asia Society and a senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government. And without further ado, I will hand over to our moderator, Konstantin Lisnyaichi. Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Yes, hi everybody. So it's my honor to be here today. We have a really cool speakers today. So let's start with the first speaker, Oleg. Oleg currently currently fighting in Ukraine. He's a reserve officer, and we want to hear your perspective on what's going on in Ukraine just right now.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here and honored to talk first and actually to also listen to Mr. Prime Minister and Mr. Ambassador. I would like to share my personal view of how a non-military person, a reserve officer, who a few months ago worked at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., joined the army and what I see. First of all, the world sees Ukraine defending itself successfully and winning the battles. And the people of Ukraine rallied around the president and the armed forces of Ukraine. And this is what everybody sees. But inside, people who have enlisted see how much work has been done in defense preparation and the effort to make people believe in the armed forces and to facilitate mass mobilization. The mobilization itself is unprecedented in the modern history and will probably enter as a textbook case for years to come. What else I see? I see business processes work smoothly, and many of them are done the same way that the World Bank is run, except in armed forces, it's much more complicated than in any modern corporation because it's complex, because you need to have increased protection of information, you need to have more complex work with personnel and logistics. And that's because the armed forces have been carrying out reforms since 2014, supported by our partners. And yes, Ukraine needs more assistance, but also Ukraine can now take more sophisticated assistance. And we are very grateful to the nations like Australia, who were giving us sophisticated modern equipment that we are up to the task to operate. Ukraine also needs international support for our fighting spirit. And we feel that we are on the right side of history. But we also pay attention to the news that some of the nations decide to be neutral or to sit on the fence or to say it's none of my business. And sometimes, while those messages are not the loudest in Ukraine, it's still something that we pay attention to, not specialists in international relations, but really common people. And since we are talking about the part of the world where Australia is one of the leading countries in G20, I would like to mention India, Indonesia, China. When the news broke that India will buy an oil from Russia with a discount of 30%, everybody was asking the question, how come? And what's going on that India, the country that used to be on the forefront of fighting colonialism, decided not to do it that time. We also saw that how Chinese TV picked up the news about massacre only after the Russian side tried to object to it, try to say that it's not true. We also heard that Indonesia was thinking of buying Russian oil, and we also heard that G20 is chaired by Indonesia and will be chaired by India, and Russia is going to attend it. And moral support is a vaccine against cynicism and indifference. Through moral support, we can get the message across about war crimes, about destroyed infrastructure, about reparations or some kind of compensation for this destroyed infrastructure. Also about blocking trade in the Black Sea, which leads to a hike in food prices and probably hunger at the end in some poorer countries who are, some of them don't even support Ukraine, sometimes even proactively. This moral support is also important for us because Russian citizens may be completely brainwashed that Ukraine appears to them as an enemy, but if the world says no, it also is an important message for them. Since we talk about Australia and the role of the Asia-Pacific region, I must say that I'm thrilled to hear the message of Prime Minister Rudd about China and how the world needs to find the arguments to convince China to lead to the life up to its global role and global citizenship, and to become on the part of the right side of history. Also going broader to Asia Pacific, it has become an engine of global growth, global innovation, global leadership, and yet this war somewhere far from the Asia Pacific region can hinder this in the 21st century. So this would be my first question to our distinguished guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oleg. I'll pass word to Demian Belayev, who is the current president of the Harvard Club of Ukraine. The floor is yours, Demian.
Yes, thank you very much, Konstantin. I graduated from Harvard Kennedy School 20 years ago, and I would speak a little bit on the issue of the future economic recovery and the main challenges associated with that. Because, as you know, the damages have been high and they are growing. Unfortunately, my city, Kiev, has also been damaged. At least 100 buildings have been destroyed. And the experts estimate that 50% of GDP will be lost. That is, the economy will lose a half of it. And as President Zelensky recently estimated, the existing damage, it was actually by the end of April, he estimated that the damage has been of $600 billion. So unfortunately, we can expect it go up to 1 trillion probably. And the debt of Ukraine is about $55 billion now, and is growing by 3 billion per month. So actually, we cannot take any more loans and increase the debt further. The good news is, of course, that, for example, last week, there has been a conference in Warsaw with donor countries that agreed to provide the first 6 billion. But if you compare of aid, But if you compare 6 billion and 600 billion of already existing damage, or you of course see that it's only 1%. And this aid will go for humanitarian aid to support the budget liquidity and the reconstruction of the country after the war, which is my main concern. There has been a discussion about a creation of a trust fund that will be activated for that purpose. There have been discussions about confiscating Russian assets, for example, the property of those individuals from Russia who are now under the EU sanctions, and the confiscation of the reserves of the Russian central bank that are stored in the United States. On the Ukrainian side, the presidential office has proposed a plan of economic recovery after the war, which correctly stresses that we will need a combination of two things, which is difficult to reach. In fact, we need an access to G7 markets, not only for 1 year, as now with Great Britain, but maybe for 5, 10, or better 15 years. But it should be, in fact, for having an effect, it should be an asymmetric access, because we still need to increase the localization of production in Ukraine, and we need to increase the level of technological complexity. So if it will be a bilateral access, then the Ukrainian economy will not be able to compete. And of course, this economic reconstruction will be a chance, because even if major urban areas are destroyed, we could use it as an opportunity to make a transition to a quality urban planning, to a cutting-edge urban planning according to the best world standards. We could, for example, increase the energy efficiency of the buildings that will be newly constructed. We could increase the ecological quality of these construction materials. But for that, we really need a vision of modernization, because this is, on the one hand, an opportunity. On the other hand, this is a risk, because we have a lot of experience with construction traditions and infrastructural projects in Ukraine, and we unfortunately see that often the task is to provide the cheapest quality and the maximal profit. And some of these funds that are given for infrastructural projects, they go, we can say, to private pockets. And therefore, when we consider this opportunity, this emotion of this willingness to help across the entire world, this opportunity to create a kind of crowdfunding platform, turn Ukraine into a crowdfunding platform for newest best practices of territorial development, we should make sure that this aid and the funds allotted, the funds spent for these purposes, will be spent in a transparent manner, that they will be internationally audited, and that also on the Western side of this funding process, there is no corruption. Because now I'm joining a research project in Europe across several universities, which deals exactly with this problem of corruption, and the available experience shows that it is never one-end phenomenon. It is not that the West, let's say, gives money with best intentions, and then some evil guys in Ukraine just steal part of those money, and it's never like that. There's always someone on the other end who helps doing it. Otherwise, it would be impossible. For example, if we take Switzerland, they have now blocked 7 billion of Russian deposits, which are related to the Russian government and in the individuals who are sanctioned. But if you ask yourself how much money is in Switzerland from Russia, the estimates range from 200 billions to 1 trillion. So when they block 7 billion, it's just to say we have blocked, look, but it's not a real objective in that case. So that's one example. And I think this is the most crucial issue for the post-war economic recovery as a chance, but also as a risk. And I think all of us should be aware of that. And my question would be to other panelists, maybe to comment on that briefly. Thank you.
Thank you, Damian. Thank you for your perspective on economic recovery. We're gonna definitely have more questions on that a little bit later. So I just want to give floor to Daniel Pasko, former Harvard Club of Ukraine president and also member of the board. Please, Daniel.
Thank you, Konstantin. I think it would be good if you would turn on my video also, because I cannot do it from my computer. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to the Harvard community for organizing this panel. Thank you very much for the speakers who joined us, for the guests who decided to listen in. My name is Dan, and I was born and raised in Ukraine. Then I went and got my MBA at Harvard Business School, from where I graduated in 2010. And since then, up until February 24th, I was in private equity. Over the course of my private equity career, I invested more than $100 million into tens of Ukrainian companies. And the core focus of our team were Ukraine and the neighboring region. 1 week before February 24th, a little over 1 week, I got married, and I was on my honeymoon traveling with my wife when Russia attacked Ukraine. And all of that was the life before. And I think for most of Ukrainians, the life now is divided between the life before and the life after. What am I doing in the life after? For about a week after the war started, I think my life was in complete chaos. I was trying to help my other family members evacuate, trying to help my team members get to safety, managing the portfolio companies, some of which became the core of the crucial food infrastructure in Ukraine, ensuring the safety of the staff, sending money to buy equipment, helping to raise awareness globally. And after about a week, I sat down meditating, and I understood that all of my actions had been somewhat random and sporadic, trying to address a lot of things and with questionable results. So out of that meditation, I came out with realization that I need to focus my resources and the resources of the team around me on one thing. And I decided that that one thing would be helping children who have lost one or both parents as a result of Russian war against Ukraine. And that's how the initiative Children of Heroes had been started. The reasons for that are a little bit personal. My father died when I was 17, and I have two younger sisters. So me and my sisters, we were growing up in such a family. So I understand the challenges which the children are facing when they're growing up in such a family. The same day, I did a Zoom call for my team of my fund, and I announced that I will be doing this initiative, and I suggested the other team members to join me. Most of them accepted this offer, and most of them brought their family members to operate our initiative. Our mission is to surround those children with everything which they need right now and provide them tactical help, financing, evacuation to safety, psychological support, education, anything else they might need right now. But our mission is long-term. We would like to support these children as they grow up. And our goal is for this group of children, which we take care, to grow up normal members of the global society. Our personal long-term KPI is that when those children grow up, this group has to have higher than average salary, higher or the same as average number of marriages, lower or average number of divorces, and they have to be happy. And when I say average, I'm not talking about Ukrainian average, I'm talking about global or average of developed countries. Now, my mission on this panel is to talk a little bit about humanitarian issues. So I will give you a few numbers about the humanitarian challenges overall, and then I will come back to the challenges and humanitarian issues with children through some of the stories of the children which we are taking care of. So I'll start with high-level numbers. So according to United Nations, as of today, there is 6 million people, 6 million Ukrainians who had to leave the country and are now living in the European Union and other parts of the world. In addition to that, there is 8 million people who had been internally displaced. So overall, it's 14 million people, 1/3 of a 40 million people country. Most of those people are women and children. Also, UN estimates that as of today, there is 3,200 civilians who have been killed and over 3,400 who had been wounded. I think what is important to say that those UN estimates are hugely underestimated because the way they count for dead is only after death had been officially confirmed, which is clearly not the case for a lot of Ukrainian territory, for example, like Mariupol, which had hundreds of thousands of civilians who had been under siege. Another problem is forced evacuations to Russia. According to some estimates, there had been around 400,000 people who had been evacuated to Russia. And my personal estimation is that 3/4 of those people had been forcefully evacuated to Russia without knowing or willing to go there. Out of them, only 100,000 is from Mariupol itself, and a big part of them are children. In terms of army casualties, official figures is over 3,000, but again, my personal estimation is that it's well over 3,000 because Ukrainian army publishes over 20,000 Russian soldiers killed, so it should be more Ukrainian soldiers killed according to these estimates. Now moving to the issues related to children. So out of this 14 million displaced, about 1/2 is children. So 7 million children of Ukraine right now are living in temporary homes outside of their normal communities without access to their normal schooling. 226 children had been killed and 417 children had been injured. And over 2,000 children had been forcefully evacuated to Russia, in many cases being separated from their families. So this is the overall figures, and I will come back to the figures of Children of Heroes. As of today, we have 128 children in our program, which we are helping day to day. Out of this 128 children, 14 children lost both a father and mother. 106 lost a father and 8 lost a mother. 37 of those 128 children are now outside of Ukraine, and 51 are in Ukraine, but not living at their homes. So more than half are not living in their normal communities. We are adding about 5 children per day under our program, and we're just 40 plus days old. Now, to finalize, those were just overall statistics, but I think the stories of the children are representative of the challenges which Ukrainians are facing. I'll tell you several stories of the children which we are working with. I'll start with the story of Andriy. Andriy is 15 years old and he was living near Kiev. He was in the car of his parents with his mom, with his aunt, and with aunt's daughter and a son coming back from Irpin when they were all blown up on a landmine. And all of them, except Andriy, died. Andriy has both legs fractured and an injury of his skull. He had been evacuated with his father to Sweden, where he undergone operation on his legs. Then we were looking for a 6 months rehabilitation facility for him where he can live and study. We found one in Belgium, and we moved him and his father to Belgium, where it turned out that there had been a mistake done in the operation in Sweden, and he undergone another operation 2 days ago to make sure that he doesn't lose his legs. He's safe right now, and he is rehabilitated. The second story is of a 6-year-old boy called Gardy from Donetsk region. Their family had been trying to escape the fighting on their car. They were driving on a highway. They saw a Russian tank with some Russian military around it. They stopped. The father went out of the car with his hands up, trying to say that they're civilians. He had been shot dead, and the car started to being shot at. The mother closed Gardy with her own body, and she was shot dead. Gardy is the only one who survived. He is right now with his grandparents in Western Ukraine. There, our help is mostly psychological for the grandparents and Gardy in order to figure out how to deal with this tragedy. The boy Vyacheslav, he's 19, and he has 4 younger siblings. They are also from Donetsk region. They were at their home when a bomb destroyed their house and killed their mother. The father was not with them. The father had been dead a couple of years ago. So the 19-year-old Vyacheslav took care and now became the legal caregiver for the 4 siblings. They are now in Western Ukraine, and we're helping him, working on collecting funds to buy them an apartment there to live in. The last story of a boy, Valery, who is from Kherson. Their parents, he has 2 younger sisters, twins. Their parents were driving home from a coal plant when they've been stopped and shot dead by the Russians. And now Valery is a guardian of those twin sisters. The twin sisters stopped talking after this incident. And we are mostly dealing with Valery, and our help there was both financial, educational. We set up online education for them, and they're now on the Russian occupied territory. We organized them a facility to move into, a house outside of Ukraine. But the challenge there is that right now they cannot get out of Kherson because it's controlled by the Russian military. So I think those several stories are representative of the humanitarian challenges which the people in Ukraine are facing right now. There was a question of how you can help. Both I left my email in the chat box, so you can contact me, or you can scan this QR code here in order to learn more about our initiative. I really appreciate your interest and your support for Ukraine and our cause, and I will be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much, especially for this service. And now I believe just we have to figure out how all our community can help can help you in this initiative. So just I am grateful also to welcome Ambassador Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Vasyl is Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Konstantin. I'm very happy to be here on this panel. I had never spent time in Harvard, but I spent a year at the London School of Economics, where I did my master's in 0506. I'm new to Australia. I arrived here 7 weeks ago. I was still in Kiev when Russians invaded on the 24th of February. I'm sort of coming here at the times of war and being a wartime ambassador. I was very pleased and happy to see so much support coming from the Australian people, no matter where I went for the past 7 weeks. And I visited, I'm currently in Perth, but I visited and engaged with government, civil society, business, and in all cities of Australia, major cities of Australia, except for Darwin and Hobart so far. Look, I want to sort of give you kind of a bigger picture a little bit, sort of like backtrack. Of course, the horrific stories coming from Ukraine are heartbreaking, and they're very difficult to comprehend because the heinous crimes which are committed by the Russian troops in Ukraine are so staggering and are so unimaginable in the 21st century, but they are happening. So to sort of backtrack a little bit, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not new. We've seen it for the past 300 years, if I may say. Ukraine's history has been tumultuous. We've been part of different empires. We were part of Ottoman Empire, we're part of the Russian Empire, we're part of the Lithuanian Polish Empire. So the history of Ukraine was not an easy one. However, the history of Ukraine in the 20th century was probably the most difficult one. And we have suffered a lot from the Russian dominance, from the Russian imperialism. And it's been always the aim of Russia to destroy Ukraine, to destroy Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture. They have, when Russian Empire collapsed and Ukraine had 3 years of independence, it was from 1917 to 1921, that independence was squashed by the Bolshevik troops who came to Kiev and destroyed the country, took over the country, and declared the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, which joined the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, in the early 30s, when the Soviets started the collectivization of Ukraine, Ukrainians did not want to join the collective farms. So in order to force them to do that, Stalin has organized an artificial famine, which led to the deaths of 6 million people. Later on, during the Second World War, Ukraine was a territory where all the major battlefields took place. If you look at the casualties of the Soviets in the Second World War, out of 27 million people who have died, 12 million of those were Ukrainians, actually, followed by Belarus and then followed by the Russians. At the times during the Soviet Union, Moscow has always been trying to squash any resistance which was coming. But then Soviet Union collapsed. Everybody was very surprised that such a big empire could break away, and generally it broke away quite peacefully. There were some certain skirmishes and conflicts in Transnistria and in the Caucasus, but generally it was very peaceful. And many people could not believe that it would happen in this way. In 2014, Russians invaded Ukraine. They grabbed Crimea. They grabbed and started a major war in Donetsk and Luhansk. Over 14,000 people have died. Major battlefields took place in 2014, 2015. And we've had this war for the past 8 years now. Maybe that's also one of the reasons why Ukrainian society has been so resilient. This war was not new to us. We've been out there. We have people in combat, and we've been getting ready for this invasion. So I have to be frank that when the buildup of the Russian troops started happening on the borders of Ukraine, I really did not believe that they would really invade the country. We all were discussing in different kind of national security circles that maybe that's part of the strategic ambiguity where Russia wants to have more leverage over Ukraine. Also an interesting fact, and it's almost an anecdote, I was in Paris 2 weeks before the invasion, and I attended and moderated the panel at IFRI, which is one of the leading foreign policy think tanks in Paris. And I have to tell you that the view of the French was that Russians will not invade. Though France is part of NATO and they're getting the intelligence from the Americans, however, their interpretation of the developments was different from that of the US or UK, for that matter. So when Russians invaded, it was a big surprise for my family. We woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning. My wife said, "Look, now time to pack. We have to go." So we jumped in the car. 2 hours packed, 2 kids. My daughter is 18. My son is 5. We tried to leave the city, but it was impossible because there was such a huge traffic jam. We ended up spending the night on the outskirts of Kiev, staying at our friend's place, spent a big night in the basement because that was already only 15 kilometers from Hostomel. This is where the major battlefields took place, where the Russian airborne troops tried to land. And 2 days later, we managed to find fuel and escape to my hometown, which is in southwestern part of Ukraine. 2 days later, my wife asked me to take her out of the country, to evacuate her to Romania. And this is what I did. My kids got traumatized. They talked about war. They were scared. So I took them to the border. In those days, crossing a border in Ukraine was something unbelievable. People would spend 2 days in a line until they could reach the checkpoint. So my family, I sent them out on foot because it was the fastest way to do that. They crossed the border outside of Chernivtsi. My friend from Moldova, who now lives in Romania, his father came over, picked them up, and they stayed in Romania for 3 weeks. In mid-March, I was appointed as Ukraine's ambassador to Australia. I followed the same route. I crossed the border on foot, made it to Bucharest. 5 days later, I jumped on a plane and came to Sydney. I presented my credentials on the 1st of April and have been working here intensively and relentlessly all the time, engaging with the Australian government, with the Australian public and business as well. Look, I want to sort of give you some of the ideas why Russia invaded, because I think it's very important. I think Russia invaded because Ukraine was an existential threat to Putin. And that threat came not because we posed any threat per se to Russia, but because having a democratic country next door, which has been changing governments, which has free elections, which has freedom of press, which has very vibrant civil society, a country which is aspiring to be part of the European Union, this was a threat to Vladimir Putin because this is something he could not tolerate. He always had this dream of reviving the empire. And his calculus was very simple. He looked at the disastrous exit of the American troops from Afghanistan. He saw the change of government in Germany. He saw that Paris was getting ready for elections. He just found, and that was a comedian running the country, right? So that was his kind of estimate of what he has to do. And he invaded. All the Western analysts have predicted Ukraine would fall in 3 days. Ukrainian ambassador in Germany went to see the Minister of Finance in Germany on the 3rd or the 2nd day of war and asked for money to buy weapons. And that minister said, look, we're not giving you any money. Your government is going to fall. We're going to work with a puppet government and that's it. So the ambassador leaves that office, tells it to the public. It goes all over the German media. And the rest is history. So we know that we have been able as Ukrainians to defeat a myth of the almighty Russian military. Apparently, it's not that mighty. In many respects, it's quite inept. Ukraine has been able to mount a fierce resistance, which has united our entire society with one goal, to defeat the Russians, to repel Russians from our territory. And we've been working on that. It's not an easy task, as you can imagine, because the weapons which Russians are using are really serious. Russians have used cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. They've even been using banned weapons such as thermobaric bombs, cluster bombs. This is a serious weapons which have been used against Ukraine. Putin built his campaign on an assumption that Russian-speaking people of Ukraine are Russian. And that assumption was wrong, because it turned out that Russian-speaking people of Ukraine are Ukrainian. Now, after he's bombed all the Russian-speaking cities of Ukraine, such as Kherson and Kharkiv and Izum and Mariupol, all these cities in Chernihiv, they all were Russian-speaking, and whatever pro-Russian sentiment which could have existed there, perhaps 20%, maybe less, is now gone. I think it's now around 0. I think there is no sympathy to Russians. Most of the Russian population are supporting this war. It's very important to understand it. Though we may blame the Putin's regime, however, if you see the surveys coming from Russia, if you see how the Russian economy is working on the military might of Russia and filling it up, if you listen to the intercepted conversations of the Russian soldiers, if you actually look at the war crimes which are perpetrated by the Russians in Ukraine, this is horrific. This means that the entire nation is to blame. That's just the same as in Nazi Germany had to take 20 years to be denazified and re-educated. The problem with Russia is we do not know what to do with Russia. I'm confident that this is what we are seeing in Ukraine. That's classical underdogs fighting a big enemy, David and Goliath story. But for us, Ukrainians, I think this invasion of Russia of 80 years ago, and actually this major invasion happening now, has actually contributed to a birth of a political nation. We have Ukrainian speakers, Russian speakers, we have Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, Muslims, and Protestants all united together fighting one enemy. And this is an unbelievable for our history. Of course, we have to live through that, through this blood, through this suffering, which is unbearable. And of course, our population and our people are bearing the brunt of this war. But I believe and I'm confident that I see a bright future for Ukraine. I believe that seeing the support of the Western governments, seeing all the weapons which are now coming into Ukraine, the Australian support, American support, UK support, even France and Germany has started sending weapons, and they've been doing it systematically. We now started getting the offensive weapons. This is what we need to repel the Russians from Ukraine, because any offensive weapons which are used in Ukraine are for the defensive purposes. We've been able to sink several Russian ships, which was a major breakthrough for our military. Of course, we don't have the sophisticated air defense systems, and this is what we need to protect our skies, because the dominance of Russians in the air is out there. So it's still very difficult to deal with that. And as well, as you can see, with the long-range missiles that they're using against Ukraine, there's not a single safe place in Ukraine. They've been sending missiles to all cities, all different parts. Just 3 days ago, they've sent 7 missiles to Odessa, destroyed the beautiful airport there that was built for over 10 years. And I was there last year. I was so happy Odessa finally got a new airport. They just another missile hit a mall. So it's very indiscriminate. The pressure which is put, the civilian casualties and actual attack on the civilian is on purpose, is deliberate. The main goal of that is to put more pressure on the Ukraine's political leadership. So hence the war crimes which are perpetrated by the Russian troops have even a reason, I think. Then the reason is to instill terror, to intimidate people, to put pressure on the Ukraine's political leadership to surrender. And now almost, how many, 75 days later, we keep on fighting. We keep trying to keep our spirits up. I think morale is high, but we do need that support coming from all corners of the world, because we cannot sustain without that support. You have to understand that this is not the Russian war against Ukraine. That's a Russian war against a free democratic world. And Russia will not stop there. If we allow Ukraine to fall, we're going to create a precedent where other countries will be changing borders by force. And that's a very dangerous precedent. We don't know how that's going to influence the situation in the Middle East, or how it may embolden Iran, how it can embolden China here in the region. We already see these ramifications from this war, and they will be serious. So we're now talking about global security. Of course, there are very different countries which have different views on this. And speaking of Asia generally, of course, Prime Minister Rudd will elaborate further on that some countries have their own relationship with Russia, which, like India, they've always been, all these other countries of the Southeast Asia, they've been always non-aligned during the Cold War. And a lot of their policy now stems from the fact they were non-aligned during the Cold War. Some of the Asian countries, they pursue their interests. They have large populations which they need to feed. So often the issues such as values, freedoms, which are more sort of relevant to Western societies, are not so pertinent to the Asian society. So we need to sort of look into their societies before we discuss or criticize them. But this is just a different outlook on many different issues. Well, anyways, I don't want to be taking too much of the time. I sort of wanted to give you a little bit of a lay of land of why Russians invaded, what they're doing in Ukraine, why Ukraine needs support. It's now, being here in Australia, I see a bipartisan support coming both from Labour and Liberals. There are elections upcoming in a week time. And I was assured by both sides that no matter who's going to win, Australia will carry on supporting Ukraine. And this is, of course, phenomenal. And I'm lucky to be in Australia and not anywhere else, because not all Ukrainian ambassadors have this kind of reception that I've had here since I arrived. I will soon be accredited to New Zealand, and I will be covering New Zealand as well. And I'm responsible for 8 Pacific Islands for that matter. Well, I think that's enough from my side. I tried to sort of run through some of the key points I wanted to share with you. And I'll be happy to take some of the questions later on after we have the keynote from the Prime Minister. Right?
Thank you, Ambassador Myroshnychenko, for giving us your global security and military views, and also for giving us historical background that definitely help us to understand why Russia invaded Ukraine. And I just also want to mention that Vasyl will have to leave in 15 minutes. So just I will open floor for a Q&A session. So please, after we hear Kevin Rowe's speech, we will open this Q&A session. But yeah, just I want to turn the floor over to our distinguished keynote speaker, Prime Minister Kevin Rowe. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for those who have contributed to this discussion and the continued call to action across the world. Let me make a series of reflections. The first is this: speaking as a member of the international community myself, formerly a Prime Minister of a G20 country, a long-standing ally of the United States for the last 100 years, but also an active member of the United Nations system. What has been quite significant from my perspective and the perspectives of those with whom I've spoken is the sheer courage of the Ukrainian people. The courage and determination of the Ukrainian people to remain active, engaged, and determined to defend the sovereignty of their nation. For those of you who have been in professional life and have chosen to put on the uniform of your country in order to defend it, I salute you. I salute your patriotism and I salute your courage. For those of you in Ukraine who have suffered so enormously, both in terms of family members lost, the work of Daniel in catering for the children who have been orphaned by this war, this is an international humanitarian story which reaches out to the hearts of all members of the civilized world. So I would simply underline the fact that the reason we are having this conversation at all today, and the fact that Ukraine did not fall within the first 3 days, is a tribute to each and every one of you. And I salute your courage. Second, some have asked, why should the international community be engaged in this war at all in support of Ukraine? Some have criticized President Biden for describing this as a contest between democracy and autocracy. I don't criticize President Biden at all for that, because it speaks to the truth of what we are seeing unfold before our eyes. Putin runs an autocratic political system. He runs a kleptocracy. He runs a mafia-style operation masquerading as the Russian state. He runs an operation where his political opponents are either assassinated or imprisoned. And I take carefully the observation of the Ukrainian ambassador before, that what he is most concerned about is a functioning, viable democracy based on principles of open politics, an open economic system, and an open society in a large Russian-speaking or partly Russian-speaking country on his immediate periphery. So I think the characterization of this as a struggle between democracy and autocracy is valid. There is a second equally valid frame, however, which is more deeply anchored in the principles of international law. And that goes to Article 2 and subsection 4 of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits either the threat of the use of armed force or the use of armed force against the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of another state, another member state of the United Nations system. Ukraine has been a member of the UN for a very long time. It has had long-standing diplomatic relations with Moscow. It's had long-standing diplomatic relations with Beijing and the People's Republic of China. It's had long-standing diplomatic relations with the other 193 nation states that make up the total membership of the United Nations system. Therefore, when we framed as an international community the UN Charter at the San Francisco Conference in 1945, and Australia was a founding member of the UN when there were only 50 member states. And when we framed in the drafting of the Charter Article 2, outlawing war as a means of international dispute settlement, and framing that within Article 2, subsection 4, we did so because we did not want to in any way re-legitimize the means of statecraft that we saw in the period prior to 1945, where war had, and invasion and the threat of invasion had been seen as almost normal tools of international diplomacy. So this invasion of Ukraine is a fundamental violation of international law in itself. It's a fundamental violation of the UN Charter. So therefore, when we speak to the international community about what is unfolding in Ukraine, it is these two essential frames which are relevant: democracy versus autocracy, as well as the principles of international law reflected in the instruments upon which we all agreed back in 1945 in Article 2 of the Charter. Based on that, we must ask ourselves a further question, which is the role of the United Nations in dealing with this assault on the integrity of the international political system. To be frank, I have not been surprised by the stalemate in the UN Security Council, because this is consistent with consistent behavior by both Russia and China in vetoing or selectively abstaining on critical resolutions before the Council concerning the invasion of one state or by another. However, what I've been particularly disappointed by is the equivocal position of the United Nations Secretary General. I would have hoped that the occupant of the position of UN Secretary General could have used his good offices to become much more active preemptively prior to the emergence of this crisis in February of this year, and certainly immediately upon the outbreak of war, to have gone immediately to Kiev to lend his support and that of the UN Secretariat to the state which was itself having its political integrity, its political sovereignty and its territorial integrity overwhelmed by the incoming invasion of a hostile state. And instead, our Secretary General chose not to do that. And furthermore, the Secretary General chose some months later to finally visit the region, but then chose to visit Moscow first before visiting Kiev, a visit which was then welcomed by the Russians by a missile attack on Ukraine while the UN Secretary General was himself within the country. You see, UN Secretary Generals do not have a lot of independent power, but they have an independent moral voice, and their moral voice can be used to uphold the principles of the UN Charter. They also have certain reserve powers under the terms of the Charter to bring particular matters at their own initiative to the Council for the Council's deliberation. And they can initiate it on their own particular peace initiatives. And we'd seen that from time to time, for example, with Secretary General Kofi Annan in other environments in the past. And so my counsel to our friends in Kiev is, while I understand they will want to preserve a good working relationship with the UN Secretary General, I believe that Kiev needs to apply maximum leverage on the UNSG and to, frankly, shake him out of this position that somehow there is some virtue in the attempt at neutrality, which he seems to have sought to reflect in the period since the beginning of this crisis. Thirdly, let me speak about the attitude of those who have been supporting Ukraine militarily, financially, and economically. I think the United States has been first class in the level of support it's been providing to the government in Kiev, both in terms of the provision of military equipment. The Europeans have also been forward-leaning in particular, and I would salute in particular the government of the Polish Republic. But of course, there have been many offers of military assistance from various countries of Europe, and now, of course, in a welcome sense, that supply of military equipment coming from countries as diverse as the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, and others. My own country, Australia, of course, has responded to the request from Kiev for the supply of military equipment as well. I saw an interview just the other day with the Ukrainian foreign minister saying that one of the things that surprised him most was that a country as geographically remote from Ukraine as Australia would lift a finger to assist the people of Ukraine in their hour of need. Well, Australians are like that. When we see a little guy being kicked around by a big guy, when we see a democracy under attack by an autocracy, when we see fundamental violations of international law, something is triggered in the Australian political consciousness concerning basic principles of what we call in this country a fair go for all, which is Australian slang for adhering to the rules of the system. And so the challenge for the future will be for President Zelensky, aided by his foreign minister, but also driven by the combined diplomacy of Washington, NATO, Brussels, and other supporting capitals to sustain this military support for the long term. Because we know from Putin's previous behavior, both in Georgia and the military operation against Ukraine in 2014, that his predisposition is always to salami slice nation states and then to freeze the conflict until he believes and has learnt in the past that the international community's focus then slowly but inevitably drifts away. So the key challenge for the government and the people of Ukraine, led admirably by President Zelensky, is to make sure that the demand, the request for continued military supplies remains active. I noticed, for example, that the current bill for such support before the United States Congress has received some opposition, including from Senator Rand Paul. I believe that it's critical for President Zelensky to continue to intervene in the parliaments and legislatures of the world to keep this matter alive in the eyes of the democratic world. Let me go to the question which I have in large part been asked to address, which is what now happens in terms of China. And then I will conclude with some observations about what should be done militarily, diplomatically, in the humanitarian world, and also the call for economic reconstruction of Ukraine as well. But first to China and the other countries of Asia. China has a complex history with Russia for several hundred years. It has been primarily adversarial. In fact, the whole period of Sino-Soviet collaboration between, first of all, the Soviet Union and the then Chinese Communist Party prior to 1949 was a complex history. And after 49, the period of Sino-Soviet collaboration really lasted only until 1959, before 30 years of the Sino-Soviet split. But since the resolution by Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping of the outstanding questions associated with the Sino-Russian border in 1989 and consummated several years later through international treaty, what we've seen over the subsequent 30 years is the progressive normalization of Russia-China relations. And under Xi Jinping's leadership, we've seen the intensification of that relationship at multiple levels. I know for a fact from officials who have attended the summits between these two leaders that a lot of their conversation deals with the threat each feels arising from color revolutions supported by the democratic world within their own countries. And therefore they have sought, as it were, increasing levels of political solidarity with each other to deal with their own deep domestic anxieties about the long-term political legitimacy and stability of their own systems. Beyond that, from China's perspective, they have sought to maximize a benign relationship with Moscow in order to maximize the deployment of their strategic resources elsewhere in the world in dealing with the country which they believe represents the ultimate challenge to China's emergence as a dominant global power and regional power, and that country is the United States. And China has also seen some historical benefit strategically in seeing the Russians, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya, or elsewhere in the world, providing a rolling source of strategic distraction, as they would see it, for the United States beyond the Indo-Pacific region. I've looked very carefully at the Chinese position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I've read very carefully the joint declaration between Putin and Xi Jinping on the 4th of February just prior to the opening of the Beijing Winter Olympics. I looked very carefully at the subsequent statements by the Chinese system about the unfolding invasion of Ukraine, and I've looked very carefully at how China has sought to abstain from the most critical resolutions in both the UN Security Council and the nature of the Chinese vote in other resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly and on the expulsion of the Russian Federation from the Human Rights Council. China is seeking to sit on the fence. The challenge of international diplomacy is to make that position in the long term increasingly politically untenable for China. China ultimately believes that Europe, in its own strategic view, is strategically soft, and that with the lure of Chinese trade and the size of the Chinese economy and what Xi Jinping describes as the gravitational pull of that economy over time, that when we roll the clock forward to 2023 and 2024, in what the Russians would have told the Chinese will be a long frozen conflict, that the Europeans will lose their strategic and economic resolve on the Ukraine question, as they saw Europe lose its resolve after 2014 and the initial Russian invasion. For those reasons, therefore, it's important that we remain vigilant in terms of China's efforts to, as it were, be seen to be neutral, while in fact leaning heavily in Moscow's direction. If you want data on that, I saw economic data produced just the other day, which has China's imports from Russia increasing by some 65% since the invasion in February. In other words, China's continued purchase of Russian commodities, oil, gas, and agricultural commodities, will continue to provide hard currency for the Russian Federation, together with, of course, Russia's continued exports to other parts of the world, thereby offsetting the impact of international financial sanctions against Russia, the freezing of its foreign reserves held in US dollars and in other hard currencies from the rest, and its removal from the US dollar-denominated SWIFT system of international financial transactions. So China will continue to maintain this ambiguous posture at one level, that is technically neutral for the purposes of international political consumption, while substantively leaning heavily in Moscow's direction. Let me conclude my remarks by moving on to some reflections on where to from here. And I'd make four sets of remarks. One, in terms of the continued military assistance to be provided to Ukraine, as I said earlier in my remarks today, it will remain critical for the government in Kiev, through its diplomatic network around the world, to remain active in placing its needs on a rolling basis before the international community, to identify clearly and honestly and frankly, to the extent that that's possible in terms of battlefield secrecy, the successes which are being achieved with particular weapon systems, but also where the new needs are emerging. Mention before was made of the fact that in this country, Australia, we're about to have our own democratic elections in 1 week from tomorrow. The pleasing thing about this country is that both the Conservatives and ourselves from the Australian Labor Party have a bipartisan position of absolute support for the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. So our own participation in continued military support for the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces will continue beyond this election if my party forms the next government of Australia, as the opinion polls at this stage indicate is likely to be the case. On the question of international diplomatic support, I would continue to drill down on the importance of the government in Kiev taking a harder line approach with the UN Secretary General and a harder line approach with the government in Beijing, that any attempt at neutrality in this particular dispute, given the flagrant violation of international law which has occurred under the terms of Article 2 of the UN Charter, is not one where countries can remain ambiguous. The ultimate reality in this is as follows. If it is made possible for a large state to resort to pre-1945 tactics to violate and subjugate the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of another state in violation of international law, then it sets an appalling precedent for the future for all states. And therefore, the argument to be engaged in the international community beyond that of democracy and autocracy is about the underlying fabric of international law. The thing about small states and medium powers is that, unlike great powers, we rely upon the fabric of the international system to uphold our sovereignty and our integrity, and to help prosecute our national interests in terms of international commerce, etc. If, however, we simply stand idly by while another country like Ukraine is subjugated, invaded and then subjugated, then frankly it becomes the question of who next. The overall global significance of the courage of the Ukrainian people, the courage of those who have worn the uniform of the Ukrainian military, and the sterling political leadership of President Zelensky, both at home and abroad, is that you've demonstrated to the world that bullies can be stood up to. And you've given courage to the world on that question as well, when we confront the possibility of rising autocracies in various theatres in the world. And the third point I'd make is on international humanitarian assistance. And I'm very mindful of Daniel's record before of what's happening with children and what is happening in deaths, what is happening in those who have been injured, and those who are now effectively refugees in the world. I believe this should form the basis of a formal representation to the UN Secretary General to make sure that there is a robust and well-funded international humanitarian fund, both for refugees in the country, refugees outside the country, as well as those who have, of course, had their livelihoods undermined as a result of this brutal Russian invasion and attempted occupation. There should be a trust fund established for these purposes, rather than it simply being assumed that all the financial responsibility for dealing with Ukrainian refugees temporarily or the long term should be borne by neighbouring states such as Poland and Romania. And the final point, to build on what was said before, is that the World Bank, backed by the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, should form itself a Ukrainian Reconstruction Fund, to which all the central banks and development agencies of the world contribute to begin the long task of reconstruction of the destroyed infrastructure of Ukraine for the future. But for that to occur, we must first stabilize the conflict itself, which brings us back to the military equation that I began by discussing in the first place. I will leave my comments there. I'll leave this broadcast fairly soon. I hope that's been of some benefit to those who are participating in it. Back to you.
Thank you, Prime Minister Rudd, for all your support. First of all, it's a great speech. Thank you for addressing the role of UN in global security and elaboration of the role of US, EU, China, and Australia in this war. Now, before we start our Q&A session, we will show a short video recording made by the Harvard Ukrainian Students Association. And I will ask Stefan to share this video, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diana Lysenko. I'm a graduate student at Harvard. I was born and raised in Lviv, Ukraine. Together with my undergraduate counterpart, Nika Rudenko, who's from Donetsk, Eastern Ukraine, we had the Harvard Ukrainian Student Association, or HUSA. Our main goal is to support the innocent people of Ukraine through various fundraising initiatives to secure vital medical and humanitarian aid. There are various ways to collaborate with us. We'll be happy to connect you and tell you more about the work that we do. Please email us or visit our website and consider donating to our fundraiser. You could see our contact info on the slide right now, and you'll also get an email that contains this information later. I wanted to emphasize that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Please, we must do everything to not let Putin win. Slava Ukraini!
Okay, so probably can start our Q&A session. And let me start with the first question that we'll address to all panelists. Obviously, Russian President Vladimir Putin and his top military commanders understand that they most likely will lose in this war as the whole world stays united against Russian aggression. At the same time, Russia cannot stop war as defeated party at this moment and needs solutions how to save face. If we imagine that, if you can imagine that you would have a chance to advise personally to President Putin on the possible ways how to stop this war, what advices would you provide? What actions would you recommend him to do? Please, let's start with Oleg.
Well, I don't think I should address this question because part of the military that fights and is not in position to advise. I am intrigued by the question and I look forward to hearing particularly Prime Minister Rudd's answer.
Konstantin, I'm happy to comment.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I don't think I would give any advice to indicated person. I don't think he listens to advices, and moreover, I don't think there is anyone in the world who would be able to advise anything which is related to common sense to him right now. I would rather answer in terms of my outlook of how, considering my understanding of the regional context and understanding of personality of this individual and other individuals around him, how I think the situation will evolve. Unfortunately, my personal forecast is quite negative. I do agree with the statement that there is no way out of the situation for the group which is in power in Russia right now. And unfortunately, understanding this position, they will continue their fight against democracy and their fight against Ukraine. Moreover, unfortunately, in this fight, there is ever-growing probability of use of weapons of mass destruction. Bear no doubt that those individuals are sharing absolutely different values, and those individuals never stopped in the past by any moral boundaries, and they will not be stopped by any moral boundaries in defending their position of power and their wealth, which they accumulated, and their worldview, including uses of weapons of mass destruction. Moreover, I see that as the time progresses and as the position of this group weakens, the probability is unfortunately increasing. And to expand it to a broader context, and since we are talking to the audience which is in the Asian hemisphere, my personal view is that this is not just a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is a conflict between, let's say, American-led Western world and China-led non-Western world. And both Ukraine is in this conflict a proxy of that Western world fighting for the Western values, and Russia is a proxy of that non-Western world. Unfortunately, in this conflict, the powers are benefiting. And in my view, the biggest beneficiary of this conflict is actually China, because the weaker Russia is, the more gravitation it has towards China. And for China, I think it's strategically important to get access to the resources which Russia possesses. And as a result of this conflict, Russia is more than welcome to supply those resources to China. So their alliance will be only strengthening. And if we look at this as this from this context, the conflict will only be increasing and only be continuing.
Prime Minister Rutte, what's your view on that question?
Yeah, I will be leaving you very soon in this conversation. So let me make 2 or 3 points. My field of expertise at a scholarly level is Chinese politics. I'm not an expert in Russian politics. I've been to Moscow quite a number of times. I have met Putin, I've met Lavrov, I've met Ushakov, I have met others in the Russian system, Peskov and others. But I'm always conscious of what I do not know. So let me go on to what I do know, which is the question of the continued confidence which Russia derives from its assumption that China's support is long-term, broad and deep, diplomatically and economically. The bottom line is, within the Chinese system, there are many debates at present about the wisdom of where Xi Jinping has taken Chinese diplomacy in support of Russia's extreme position on Ukraine and have challenged internally Xi Jinping's decision to begin to engage directly in the internal politics of NATO and the European Union. For example, China's formal position to oppose any form of NATO expansion. This is a reasonably recent departure for China, which has basically seen these questions as European in nature. So therefore, the overall point I would make is, while I understand that the government in Kiev does not want to alienate Beijing, my argument is that there is probably wisdom in the Ukraine adopting a much more overt, direct, and strong posture, publicly and privately, with China to place pressure on China in terms of its long-term solidarity with Russia on this particular question. And in doing so, understand that there are forces at work within the Chinese system which are concerned about Chinese overreach on this point. That's one set of comments, and I'll leave you with this concluding set of remarks, as I must leave you at the top of the hour. And it's as follows, that Russian confidence does not just depend on its continued access to Chinese diplomatic and economic support. It also is based on the long-term access which it has to European, in particular, energy markets. And so there is a critical question here, and that is, long-term European energy security cannot just be wished away. People in the rest of Europe need to have energy. So therefore, what is required is a level of global leadership by the United States and by its principal allies to re-engineer long-term supply of oil and gas to the European market. Oil out of the Middle East and out of the Gulf states. But in terms of gas, there are other suppliers as well, including my own country, Australia, which is the third largest supplier of LNG in the world. In other words, this is going to require a massive re-engineering of global energy politics and policy involving the biggest resource companies in the world, including companies like Chevron, including companies like Woodside, including companies like Shell, in order to underpin Europe's long-term energy security and, as a consequence, apply fresh leverage on the Russian system if its access to hard finance is therefore undermined by the loss of those European energy markets. So I think the two factors that I would suggest, quite apart from the feat of arms in the field by the brave Ukrainian people and the armed forces of Ukraine, which are more likely to have an impact on Putin, but most importantly, the kleptocratic elite who surround him in Moscow at present. And with that, to my friends from Ukraine who are speaking to us from the country, and Ukrainians around the world and to the Harvard Club, I must bid you farewell and wish you well in this continued struggle.
Thank you, Prime Minister Rudd. It's a very powerful speech, and I just want to give floor to Victoria. She will probably give one more question and closing remarks, please.
Thank you so very much. Yeah, there are two questions. Yes, there's one from Kwong EC. The other question's been deleted. Yeah, so this is a rather a broad question. First of all, what are your thoughts on the ramifications of the Ukraine-Russia war on the European Union's institutions, for example, the dissolution, the restructuring, etc.? And then your thoughts on the war, on the Middle East status, for example, Israel peace treaty, etc. I understand that Mr. Rudd has to leave very soon. I wonder if he has time to just quickly take this question. Thank you.
Both sets of questions are profoundly complex. All I would say is on the latter part of the question, which is where the war goes vis-a-vis the role of the Gulf monarchies and the Gulf monarchies' relationship with both the Russians on the one hand and China on the other. This is an area which now requires intensive American diplomacy in a way in which we have not seen in the last several years. There has been a profound drift in the overall proximity of Gulf state relations, by which I mean the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, particularly, less so Qatar. There's been a drift in terms of the relationship with the United States. This has created a whole bunch of new openings, both for Russia and China with the Gulf states, particularly on the critical question of energy politics and policy. So therefore, in the global dimension of this crisis, in particular European long-term energy dependency, this diplomacy will have to be executed effectively, rapidly, and frankly involving other major energy suppliers like Australia to deal with Europe's long-term energy security needs. But you cannot do that in the absence of cooperating states from the Gulf, including Qatar. And I must now leave you. I'm sorry, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd. Yes, we should wrap up. We're going slightly over time. Thank you very much for this scintillating discussion. I know that an hour and a half is way too short to address this very, all-consuming crisis that faces all of us, which is the whole point we're here. It's not confined to a certain region. It's really got global implications. So on behalf of the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom and the Allyship series team, we want to thank you for taking an hour and a half of your time to listen to us. And we understand that there will be questions. So I posted my email in the chat. So if you have any questions about the webinar, please just email me. And then if you want to reach any speakers and their emails are not in the chat, contact me and we'll see what we can do. So Dan Pascoe's email is already in the chat. So if you have any questions on the humanitarian nature of the war, please address those to him. We will make the video recording available. It will be on our YouTube channel. I posted that link in the chat as well. And then we'll circulate a recording of the webinar via the registrations on Zoom. So anybody who registered will be able to get a copy of the recording. The Harvard Ukrainian Students Association posted a couple of slides. I understand that the QR code may not be functional from your screen, so we could send that around as well. So we will let you go back to your daily life. This will not be the last Allyship series on Ukraine. Unfortunately, it does look like to be a protracted situation, and the fallout will be for a long, long time to come. Thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Very sobering and enlightening discussion.
Vicky, I would like to just say something very quick because we are going to have an event about Ukraine soon. Your questions posed in any form will help us shape this event in such a way that we answer those questions. And we will definitely take the question of Middle East and Europe and other geopolitical questions into that event, because our next speaker, keynote speaker, will be a very good expert on geopolitics.
Agreed. Yes, thank you. We'll announce the next event in due course.
Yes, and I also want to thank you to Victoria and Alice. Your organization of this event was superb. And also to Matthew, he just supporting a second event in row. It's very important for us. Thank you very much, and probably let's meet next time. So for those of you who are interested to hear anything new about the process of, what's going on in Ukraine, how we're going to finish war, what kind of support do we have. So just please join next meeting. So see you all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and yeah, God bless us.
Thank you all. Take
Thank
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Can we stop the recording? Oh my goodness, Vicky, that was amazing.
Brilliant.
Yeah, just Yuko, you guys, amazing.